I am good. I'm good. How are you? It's great to see you.
Doing great, doing great. Thank you so much for joining and making it work with your schedule. We need to dive into, before we start talking about your book, let's dive into your history, your journey. What got you kind of started on this track to become the expert in DEI that you are now?
Sure. Actually, I stumbled upon it just by being a leader in corporate America and being one of the very few Black people that I found in corporate America. So I had to lean in on DE&I because I usually was the only person in the room that was a person of color. And so it forced me to lean in, even though I had my day job. DE&I became my day job because I was a Black person in corporate America.
Yeah, I think for so many, it makes sense for those from the global majority to be leading these efforts because you get to bring your lived experience into the approach that you take with allowing corporate sectors and industries to kind of come up to speed with the best way to do business to ensure that everyone is included. How do you bring your lived experience to the work?
Absolutely. So, one thing that I'm really big on is identity defining moments. I call them IDMs. And these are moments in your life when you realize and you find out that you are a minority, or that you find out you're underrepresented, or you find out that there's stigma and bias because of the way you look, and it's outside of your control. And those are the moments that you have to harness because I promise you, someone else experienced the same thing, and what we're trying to do is build systems and processes inside of a corporation that acknowledge those things and try to fix it. Bias, everyone has bias. So it's not that we're going to eradicate bias. We have to build processes and systems to reduce and mitigate the bias and to call it out when we see it. And if we can call it out when we see it, then at least we can make changes. But if we sweep it under the rug, we pretend it's not there, we don't allow people to be their authentic self, and that's when these things sort of exacerbate and kind of fester.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And also too, I think when you experience bias, you have a different perspective, right? That you get to bring to that work. And oftentimes it means that you have to draw from personal experience is in order for you to be able to really pour into the work when it comes to DEI. And we saw it explode, Errol, right? I mean, we saw a lot of firms hop on the DEI train because corporate spaces and entities were paying buku bucks to try to get themselves in alignment,
Yeah.
particularly after George Floyd. It just really expanded. And I remember when I first got into the space, it was only diversity and inclusion. It was DI. And then they ended up opening and the branding up to include equity. But that oftentimes means that, a lot of folks are still kind of catching up, but it was a bit trendy. How do you deal with the fact that it's necessary amongst the kind of space where it's like, oh, this is a hot trend, I need to hop on it now? How can you make sure that it's sustainable in the companies that you help to bring DEI to their space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is you have to guard against it being performative. Many companies did want to jump on the bandwagon, and that's exactly what it was. So they made proclamations, but they didn't actually do the work. They just made proclamations. And so it might sound good on a headline or a soundbite, but the employees actually at the company were still suffering. And so you have to always guard against performative diversity, equity, inclusion, and now belonging work. And by performative meaning, you're saying one thing, but you're doing another. Your actions have to match your words. One way to do that is by actually having metrics that define success. So DE&I doesn't have to be this elusive, amorphous thing. It can actually have metrics and things that you measure. And so, for example, I always advocate for companies to have diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics around their executive compensation. The CEO, the people that report to the CEO, should be paid based on how well they're doing. And you can do that through surveys, survey your employee population. Even if the results are bad, at least you have a baseline. And then you work from there to say, okay, this is where we are. Now, how do we improve? And then you get bonuses based on the improvement of those metrics. Another thing is looking at diversity at the higher ranks of the corporation. There should be metrics that say, okay, maybe only 20% of our vice presidents are women, but we are going to get to 25, 30% over the next 3 years. Put that down on paper and rally around it. And that's going to change. That's actually where you get the change from. Leaders love metrics. And once you tell them what's the expectation, people usually follow.
Yeah, this is important. And I think that there's so much embedded in this work, particularly being able to also identify the ways that implicit bias shows up in certain practices in any type of institution, right? And so I'm learning so much more about this because it is growing. And I love to hear you say to also include belonging. And, John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute made a really strong statement about how inclusion means that I'm having a party. I love vegan food and, I love black and gold and R&B and hip hop. So if you come to my party, I'm including you in my party. But belonging means that we get to co-create, right? We get to create the party. Everyone has what they need to feel as though they belong. And it's very different, right? When you think about just the shift in mindset that belonging brings to this work, how do you see belonging as a major value add to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, exactly the point that you're speaking to, which is you need to have the ability for people to have a mouthpiece to talk, right? So I always say diversity means you have different people from different types of places get into a room. As you said, inclusion means you invited them in. Equity means we're making sure equal pay for equal work. And then belonging is I can actually be my authentic self. If people are still code switching, still feeling that they can't say certain things because they're going to be frowned upon, still nervous about wearing their natural hair. In certain states, you're seeing the Crown Act being passed. If there's still nervousness and concerns about these things, you'll never belong. And our employees will never be the highest form of themselves if they're only bringing 20, 30, 40, 50% of themselves to the workplace. You want them to bring 100% of themselves. So they have to feel like they belong. And again, the best way to do that is make sure that folks have mouthpieces. ERGs are one way to do that. They just have to really be, they just can't be there for the sake of being there. There has to be, from the top down, a big focus to listen and then actually make changes based on what we're listening to. I'll just say that the worst thing that can happen is you ask for feedback and then you do not act on the feedback, because then you might as well have never asked in the first place. That'll destroy morale. So it's really about listening and then acting.
Yeah, and that's what's going to really, I think, build trust between, employees and leaders. I mean, that's really where you're at in terms of acting upon what you hear. When you say ERGs, you're referring to employee resource groups, correct?
Correct. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just I really appreciate that you have a plethora of experience you're bringing. Tell us why you decided to write the book and why you wanted it to be out there for the public to really understand some of the things that you're talking about today.
Sure. So the book is called The Way Up: Climbing the Corporate Mountain as a Professional of Color. I was very intentional about the title. I didn't say corporate ladder. I said corporate mountain. And I believe that underrepresented employees, like Black employees, like brown employees, like women that are underrepresented, it is not a ladder. And it's a misnomer to tell people it's a ladder, because then they enter the workforce thinking there's only one way to go up and the rungs of the ladder are equal distance from each other. But that is not the case. It was more like climbing a mountain, meaning it's difficult. You have to be trained. You have to bring equipment. It's a long, arduous road. Sometimes you have to double back. Sometimes you have to make lateral movements. It's not always going to be a happy trail up the mountain. And so I wanted to start with, this is a mountain climb. You really have to be ready before you even think about it, especially in corporate America, because of the things that are happening. And then the other piece of the book is it's 15 chapters with 15 lessons, and it's grounded in research. And I did that because I didn't want someone to read the book and say, oh, that's just Errol's anecdotal story. That's just one man's story. It's like, no. My stories are basically matching what the data shows. So when I experience bias, when I experience hurdles, when I experience microaggressions, everything that I was saying was matching the data that I had. And then the last piece is I interviewed 11 executives of color. Some are amazing people, like Robert Childs is the head of DE&I at American Express, which is, Fortune 50 company. Toyin Ajayi, she's the founder and CEO of a startup that's worth $5 billion, African woman. She's in the book. So I wanted to interview a lot of other executives of color to ask for their tips, their thoughts, their recommendations on how to make the workplace more equitable. And so their findings are in the book as well. And the need of it was, I didn't want this moment to pass us by. After COVID, seeing disproportionately Black people get sick from this disease and this virus. And then, like you said, after George Floyd, people wanted to do something. They just didn't know what to do. And I thought it was the perfect time for this book to come out so that people can actually have a tangible process of what to do to try to move up in corporate America.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you, make it a mountain and bring that kind of idea to the space. I also think when I think about mountain climbing that, it's customizable. The same steps that one may take to get to a top of the mountain may not be the same steps that I would take, right? And so the idea is, I think about when you said that, I immediately thought about a rock climbing wall and how there's a bunch of different ways to like get to the top, and you get to figure out, okay, which part am I going to put my foot on now, and where am I going to put my hand now? Like the idea that it's not just these very specific steps to get there. I think that customizable approach is actually what people experience more often than not, particularly in corporate space. But I would also say that it's the same for almost any space, right? Even if you're working in community, there's a certain way that you kind of get yourself from one place or one position to another. If you're working in politics, it's similar. There are ways that some people take a whole leap between, one political career and another, or one political, accolade or title than another. And so it's interesting to hear it as a mountain. So thank you for bringing that in. And I definitely appreciate the fact that it's research-based. I think we end up with a lot of works of art and works that are trying to get people to understand certain things, but it's very anecdotal. It's very personal. It's based on what they've experienced, which is great as well. But oftentimes, it's better to have a stronger foundation so folks understand, like, not only is this specific to my instance, but you start to see a pattern of behavior when you start to bring in more voices. Of course, Errol, I got to give you time. How can folks connect with you, get the book? If you're out here doing public speaking, how do they connect to Errol Pierre?
Yeah, absolutely. So best way is to find me on my website, errolpierre.com, ErrolPierre.com. And on social media, I'm everywhere, Errol L. Pierre, Errol ErrollLPierre on all social media. I would love to talk with anyone, talk about good ideas. And the book is available anywhere you buy books, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Errol, for the work, your body of work, and for bringing your experience to corporate spaces all over America. We appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you for joining me today on The Day with Trae.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Oh.